Good morning. My name is Farrah Weaver, and I chose my major paper topic to be the Ukraine crisis. The Ukraine crisis is involving East and West Ukraine, Russia, and now NATO. Before I jump into my paper, I want to give some brief history background between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine is in East Europe and is bordering the East Russian side. It used to be a part of the Soviet Union until they declared independence from the falling Soviet Union in 1991. Since then, it has been its own nation and its own government. Even after they have declared independence, Russia still maintained major sway in the political views and political decisions made in Ukraine. Many people knew about this sway and wanted this to change. After years of negotiation with the European Union, they came upon a fair trade agreement that would allow citizens to travel through the EU without visas in exchange for new laws and regulations. On November 21st, 2013, the Ukraine government rejected the Fair Trade Accord with the European Union in favor of maintaining strong ties with Russia. This choice to side with Russia instead of the EU infuriated many people, and they took to the streets in protest. Many people protested in Independence Square, which was declared Independence Square for maintaining independence between Russia and Ukraine, and stating that they wanted to maintain independence between Russia and Ukraine. In late November, police launched a brutal raid on student protesters, TV images, and protesting that was going on in Independence Square. On the 30th of November, protesters overtook the Cliven City Hall. In November 17th, Russian President Vladimir Putin offers an economic lifeline to Ukraine, and this lifeline offer was seen to the people as basically a buy-off from Russia to Ukraine, and they basically wanted to keep quiet and buy them off to basically shut them up, and was not accepted for many people. After this agreement was accepted, the protests continued, and they greatly influenced in numbers and in violence. This escalated quickly, and Independence Square eventually became a bloodbath on February the 20th. At least 77 people were killed in a 48-hour period, and hundreds were wounded in a clash between protesters and police, including shots from uniformed snipers. This enraged protesters even more, and they continued to protest on the street because they wanted separation from Russia. They knew these accords and these actions were completely irresponsible and uncalled for because Ukraine was having was basically maintaining their strong ties with Russia, and they were not about it. The Ukraine presidency and pressure from the Ukraine, pressure from the EU, their Ukraine president Vlaskovsky signed a deal to transfer his presidential powers to the Ukraine parliament and held early elections on May 25th. So finally, the protesters got a little bit of give with the Ukraine government, and the president resigned his presidency and fled to Russia because of these protesters. And I'm sure he feared for his life because the people were not happy with his decision and his way to lead the Ukraine nation away from Russia, but instead he continued to maintain strong ties with Russia. So once the Ukraine president was vacating his office and his rights as president, the Ukrainian people got a bit of a break and got him out of office. But things were shortly lived when Russia became more involved by assigning troops to Crimea, and they basically invaded Russia. Russia states that it has a right to protect its Russian-speaking population in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. But on March 1st, the Russian parliament approved troop deployment in Ukraine, not just Crimea, but Ukraine. There are worries that Russia could move further into Ukraine, and on the 3rd of March, the Ukraine government claimed that ousted President Vlaskovsky had asked for troops to enter the Ukraine, which gave them legitimacy. This was completely against NATO, and the peace treaty claimed that they had all signed when they joined NATO. So by Russia invading Ukraine, it was breaking national law with the accordance of NATO. President Obama has urged Russia to pull out of the Ukraine, and Ukraine invoked Article 14 of the NATO, the Ukraine chapter, and requested a meeting of the NATO-Ukraine commissions, which took place on the 2nd of March 2014. Allies condemned Russia's military actions against the Ukraine as a breach of international law, which also contradicted the principles of NATO and the Russian Council as a partnership for peace. So by Russia doing this, they're protecting its people, but really they're still illegal in the principles. Now, since that I have cleared up a bit of what's going on in the Ukraine and with Russia, I want to touch on some theories I feel like plays a part in this intercultural conflict and how they relate to this conflict. So the first theory I want to talk about is the standpoint theory, which is defined in the book as a view that is based on different standpoints each hold. A standpoint is defined as a place from which to view and make sense of the world around us. Our standpoint influences what we see, what we can not or do not or choose not to see. This standpoint theory claims that the social group to which we belong shape that which we know and how we communicate. This theory can be applied to this situation by trying to see the world from other people's shoes. Russian states that the only reason military personnel are in Ukraine is to protect the Russian-speaking people who have strong ties. Putin is taking the side of protecting his own people, which is stated many times, and Russia does not want to support the protesters and feel that the government should not change. Obviously, they feel like the government should not change because they have power over the government. Of course, they don't want it to change. Most of NATO and most of America's standpoint sees the invasion of Russia as a direct threat to the Ukraine. They see that as Russia's sly way to regain lost control over the Ukraine. Ukraine's standpoint, however, is split both sides down the middle because they have a diverse population. One side of the citizens' views are more biased and supports the Russian military being there, and they want to maintain their ties with Russia for personal, financial, and economic purposes. We'll see later on in this paper that this is because of propaganda caused by Russia's influence over the media that they see. They feel like it would be the best route for Ukraine to uphold the relationship with Russia to ensure the success of the nation. This has a lot to do with propaganda that is overtaken and caused by Russia in the eastern side of Ukraine. And I'll get to that later on in this paper. The other side of the citizens views Russia as a nation that has too much involvement in their own independent nation. They want to separate themselves from Russia so they can shape their own nation how they want to shape it. They feel threatened by the Russian military being there because of their protest for independence can be overpowered by the Russian army. An all-out war could break out by Russia's military being there and getting involved with the protest. This is a result of so many different standpoints because we have an intercultural conflict that could be greatly impacted so many lives. The two different standpoints between Ukraine people cause a separation or a grouping of within two different geological locations within the Ukraine. The notion of cultural space is explained by cultural space is the construction through the communicative practices developed and lived by the people in particular places. Communicative practices include language, accents, slang, dress, artifacts, architectural design, behaviors, patterns of interactions, as well as stories, discussions, and histories. These cultures of Ukraine-speaking cultural space and the Russian-speaking cultural space make up western and eastern parts of the nation. They are almost completely split in half because of this separation. It makes it easier to construct groups and distinguish group boundaries where the others reside. Cultural identity boundaries are clear from east to west. Russia holds a cultural empower, imperialism view over East Ukraine. By me saying this, they dominate their cultural through cultural forms such as popular cultural media and cultural products. They incorporate a strong propaganda that the Eastern Ukraine want to dominate they implement a propaganda that the Western Ukraine want to dominate the eastern Ukraine, and the Ukrainization of that nation will overpower the Russian-speaking citizens there. That's why they want to maintain strong ties with Russia to protect themselves of this intra-Ukrainian propaganda and then intercultural um, overpowerment of that nation. They want to maintain their cultural and their heritage from Ukraine because they think that they will overpower them. And in fact, that is not at all what the western side of Ukraine want. They just want their independence and their separation from Russia to create a nation for themselves and to create a nation that they form instead of what Russia forms. The Western Ukraine is a less dominant culture of the Ukraine and is fighting for more independence from Russia. This is why that they are calling for the help of NATO and for America because protesters don't stand a chance against the Russian army. Um, Mercantilism is the main reason why Russia is involved with Ukraine. Ukraine is one of Russia's biggest markets for natural gas and exports, and is crucial to the root of the rest of Europe. Russia without Ukraine is a country, but Russia with Ukraine is an empire, and this is quoted from Daniel Dazar, an international politics professor at the Tufts University in Russia. And many Russian people hold this ideology that Russia can be an empire with Ukraine, but Ukraine does not want that. They want to be completely separate from Russia so they can have their freedom to create a nation of their own. Prosperity for the state is to keep the wealth acquired through trade and through the national state. And that is what the definition of mercantilism is. It's policies and practices to enhance the control economic prosperity for the state to keep the wealth acquired through the state and the trade of the nation state. That's why Russia is so involved in Ukraine because they want to keep this flow of trade and this flow of power with Ukraine, and they want to maintain that control over them because of their trade. They have already threatened to cut off their resources and their trade if they continue to uphold relationships with the EU or continue to basically rebel against Russia. The Ukraine also fails to create an equal hybrid culture space within its boundaries. A hybrid culture space is defined as a mixing of blending of cultural in the world today, and through intercultural overlapping intersection, hybrid cultural spaces are constructed. Because of Ukraine's identity boundaries, there is no mixing or blending of the two cultures. There's a separation and disagreement of the both sides because of the opposing political and cultural views. There needs to be a hybrid culture forms in the identities created between two of the nation's views to create a peaceful environment within the Ukraine. I believe a hybrid culture space could be achieved if Russia wasn't so involved in Ukraine, and the Eastern Russian-speaking side of the Ukraine needs to understand that while they still have Russian ties, they are still Ukrainians, and they still need to be separate. Russia just needs to let the Ukraine work through their own problems. If there was a war between the East and West Ukraine, it needs to be between them only. I understand that Putin is reasoning for protecting their own, but that is not his legal basis for invading Ukraine. He wants to maintain control over Ukraine, and that's basically the underlining point of the whole invasion. One person, Mia Mikahal, who has been documenting her story while living in Ukraine in her home country, has basically published her story through CNN and has reached a vast audience. She states that many people in Crimea and eastern Ukraine do not want the protection of Russian President Putin, but there are some who are afraid of the forced Ukrainization because they have been fed propaganda by Russian TV channels for years. So they fear this uprising of the Ukrainian western side. So they want to maintain those ties with Russia just in case they're not overthrown. Ukrainians are wiser than that just to kill over the non-existent problem of a language. So no civil war in Ukraine. So because of this problem and because of this insecurity among the two cultures and this unclear communication between them, it causes conflict between them because of that fear. Putin has no legal basis to be there, and so by her publishing this idea, by her many people, it is reaching the eastern side of Ukraine and basically showing them that the western side of Ukraine do not want a civil war. They just want to be separate from Russia. That's all they want. And so it's very hard for the eastern side of Ukraine to understand that they don't want to just take over the side of Europe. They don't want to take over Ukraine. They just want to be separate from Russia, and that's it. I think this is a great strategy for Ukraine as a whole. By Russia invading, it's actually helping East and West Ukraine create a more of a hybrid culture by joining forces against Russia. By showing Russia that they are a bigger people, they will hopefully create a peaceful resolution between the two sides. In my opinion, I believe NATO and America should do more to help Ukraine at this time of need. But the ways they can do this is supplying Ukraine with military support, armory, and transportation from the east side of Ukraine to the west side of Ukraine for whoever wants to leave. Obama has already stated that he will support NATO and help our allies as he threatened to cut off Russia from our trading agreements as well. And I agree with Obama on this situation and feel like he has made a good decision and a good call for maintaining our support with NATO. We learned from this intercultural conflict that different standpoints among cultures play a huge part in the decisions of the nation. Without the formation of a hybrid culture space, then there will always be conflict between two sides. This goes for any intercultural affairs, and we should maintain a hybrid cultural space, and that should be at the top of the priority for forming nations. Different cultures should peacefully work out between themselves how to identify new boundaries and how to identify themselves and create new cultural identities and new cultural forms and things among themselves and maintain clear communication. If the Ukraine did these things and maintained clear communication and wasn't almost brainwashed by Russian propaganda, then I believe that this Russian crisis would not exist. I think they would be able to trust each other and create a hybrid culture and create an independent nation against Russia. Once they do this, Russia would have no choice to either leave the Ukraine because there's no threat and there's no proximity of a civil war for Russia to even be there. So they would either have to leave or declare all out war against the Ukraine, which is halfly made up of Russian people. So Putin would have to go and fight his people for Ukraine, which is definitely not a popular decision among Russia and Ukraine. So I don't think Putin would do that as well. So I think that would be the best strategy for Ukraine is to create a hybrid culture and to create a trust between them two and to work out any political differences or cultural differences that they might have civilly instead of forcefully. This will help the formation of the nation and avoid tension buildup for the future among the two sides, and hopefully for the future create a peaceful environment for the two. Um, I think that that would be the best route as of right now to maintain that and just create a hybrid culture and peacefully sit down and speak with one another to work out their differences in a polite, civilized manner than a forceful manner. So that is my thoughts on the Ukraine crisis, and I hope my theories explained a little bit on why this crisis has taken place in the intercultural conflict and things like that. So please leave your comments below and hopefully give me any advice that you see fit, and hopefully you enjoyed my presentation and have a great day.